All right. Welcome back. This is Lesson 8 on Biblical Archaeology. We're going to go for one more lesson after today, so we're going to go to Lesson 9. And then Dennis is going to take over teaching on the Reformation as we celebrate the 500th anniversary, birthday, whatever, of the Protestant Reformation. Okay, so we, in the last 7 weeks, have gone through Old Testament archaeology. And now, are there extra handouts? Let me grab one of these and one right here. We're going to get into the New Testament these last 2 weeks. So, as I mentioned before, my website that I just remembered last night that I put it on the top of your handout. So it's hillsidecreek.wordpress.com. And the links to these videos will be up on it. Maybe by tonight I can get those up. Okay, so New Testament archaeology. What I want to talk about first is gospel manuscripts, meaning the writings of the gospel, and actually the entire New Testament, but I'm going to focus on the gospel today. These ancient copies that we have. Most of what we know historically about Jesus is what we find in the 4 Gospels. Now, there are other historical accounts about him, and I'll tell you about those, but most of the detail is in the Gospels. So the Gospels are eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life. And what we want to look at is how reliable are these accounts in the Gospels. And so first we should look at the authors of the Gospels. Who were they? Well, there was Matthew, and he was a tax collector. He was one of the 12 disciples. There was John Mark. We know him as Mark. He was a companion of Peter. And so Peter had been very close to Jesus. He was one of the 3 disciples, the inner 3, that was very close to Jesus. And so Mark wrote down Peter's experiences, and that's the Gospel of Mark. We have the Gospel of Luke, and Luke wrote down Paul's experiences. So Luke was Paul's beloved physician. And then there is John. John was one of the 12 disciples. He was one of Jesus' inner 3, the very close disciples, along with James and Peter. Now, the New Testament, the books of the New Testament were originally written in the Greek language. And all of the books were written sometime in the late 1st century. So within 70 years of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, the last of the books, which is John's Gospel, was probably written around the year 95. And then they were copied so other churches could read them. And eventually the Greek language in the Mediterranean area, it fell out of favor in the Mediterranean world. And so Latin became the dominant language. So after a few centuries, people had been copying the Gospels in Greek, but no one could read Greek anymore, not too many people. So the dominant language was Latin. So it had to be copied into Latin. So the Gospels were translated into Latin, and they were translated into other languages as well, notably Syriac and Coptic. And as the centuries go on, we're always finding need to translate the gospel into other languages. And now we need it in English, and we need it in the thousands of languages that are spread out across the world. So while we no longer possess any of the original writings, archaeologists have found roughly 5,800 Greek manuscripts that are dated from the 2nd century onward. So again, the original writings have long since crumpled to dust, but we have 5,800 either fragments, or fragments could be as small as maybe this big, or larger copies. There are a couple of spare handouts on the tables, and if y'all could distribute them to folks here.
How many copies of fragments?
5,800. Thank you very much.
On the next page.
Yeah, 5,800.
Oh, okay. There it is.
Yeah, I'm still on the first page, aren't I? Or maybe I put things in the... Yeah, I'm getting there. Okay, still on the first page. Okay, I want to show you some examples of these fragments. One that up until recently was thought to be the oldest. You can see a picture there. This is the front side and the back side. It's a fragment from John. It's officially designated Papyrus 52. All the very oldest copies of the Greek manuscripts, or even fragments, are written on papyrus. And so when the archaeologists find it and they research it, they do their dating techniques, finding where it was written, when it was written, and all these things. And it gets indexed in the papyrus index. So this is papyrus number 52. Up until a few years ago, was thought to be the oldest fragment from the New Testament. I have scaled it there on your sheet of paper too. That's the actual size of it. It's 3.5 by 2.5 inches. And again, you see a picture of the front and the back. The dating of it, it's kind of rough, but they do have it to within about 50 years. It was written, copied sometime between, well, I wrote there 90. Couldn't have been a few minutes ago. I said John was written in 95. But archaeological techniques say that this copy was copied between 90 and 140. And then you have to put on top of that we think John's Gospel was written in 95, so it wouldn't have been 90. But sometime there, within a few decades at most of John's Gospel being written, we have this copy. It is a fragment of 5 verses. It was found in a garbage dump in the 1920s in the Middle East. So one man's trash is another man's treasure. There's another fragment, I can't remember which one or if it's one of these that I highlight, that an archaeologist saw on eBay. Someone was selling it on eBay and for like $100. And the archaeologist said, "Can you stop this auction? I think we need to figure out what this is." And I think the person selling it didn't know what it was, or else it would have been more of a $1 million or more thing. But the archaeologist who fortunately caught it said, "Why don't you stop that auction and let's analyze it further." But this one was found in a garbage dump. It is in Greek. It is John 31 through 33 on one side, on the left-hand side, the front side. And then the back side, you notice those are mirror images of each other, so it's front and back, 37 through 38, those verses. So that, again, up until a few years ago, was the oldest known one. Now, just in the past few years, they found a Mark fragment of a papyrus. And you can see on your sheet below a Matthew fragment. Now notice those don't have papyrus index numbers, and that's because they haven't been officially published. The Mark fragment, I remember that it was first discovered when Pastor Al first got here. So how many years ago was that? 5 or 6 years ago. Because I remember I learned it from him and we were just discussing it. We were in this room talking about the Bible and we were just discussing it. So that's how long it takes archaeologists to publish their work. So they found it and they still haven't officially published it yet. It's hard to analyze these things. The dating techniques that they use, it takes a while. But they think that it's a copy from somewhere around the year between 80 and 90. Now keep in mind, the Gospel of Mark was written probably in the 60s. So we have a copy that's about 20 years, about 20 years removed, maybe 30 years removed from the original. The reason that's important is, as a general rule, if we're looking at, is this copy reliable, the closer in time it is to the original, the more likely it is to be reliable. Meaning, if it's been 1,000 years, you don't know what changes have happened in copying after copying. But if it's 20 years removed, there's more credibility to it that it matches the original. Let's see. So this one was found in a mummy mask. There were mummies that were embalmed. They put the masks over them. And again, one man's trash is another man's treasure. So people, and this would not be Christians, but people who were embalming mummies, they found what they considered trash. So these old codices, these old books. And so they would tear out the pages of papyrus and they would put it over the masks, put it over there. And some archaeologists found this. So it's very tricky because then you've got papyrus layers with what's the equivalent of glue, sticking them together and wrapped around this body. And so they have to very, very carefully, I would not trust my hands, this would be a surgeon's hands, very carefully peeling these thousands of year old papyrus layers away from each other and trying to restore the writing. So it's amazing they can even recognize it for what it was.
John,
yes?
Could you remind us again the consistency of papyrus? How it is it real, compare it to something we would be familiar with?
I don't know.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if it was just real, disintegrated real quickly, or...
Well,
a little
now
tougher,
I
or-
imagine, I'm just guessing here, something like this. Imagine you find newspapers from 100 years ago in the basements, and how fragile that is,
Yeah.
even more fragile than that. But the actual feel of it, I don't know.
Okay.
I'm imagining it's something like that.
And Wikipedia says it's similar to thick paper.
Like maybe constructions or something?
Okay.
Thank you.
Trust that.
Yeah.
For a lot of things you can. Yeah. Okay, there's also a Matthew fragment, and this has recently been discovered, just in the past few years, a Matthew fragment from sometime in the 1st century AD, and it hasn't yet been published. And that's why I don't have pictures of these non-published ones. And so they're still analyzing it. But we do have, it is neat to see that we have these fragment copies from the New Testament. Again, we don't have whole volumes or anything, but at least these fragments that from dating back this far. Another one is, and this one is very special to me, Papyrus 39, and it's very special to me because I saw it. I was there. I wouldn't have touched it. It was behind glass anyway. But Papyrus 39, and it was found in the same garbage dump as Papyrus 52, and it is a copy of John. The verses are fragmentary copies of John 8:14 through 22, and copied about the year 200. So we're talking about roughly 100 or slightly more, 100 years after the original writing of John. It is 10 inches by 3 inches, so about this big, and you see the front and reverse. And if you see, it's in that book that's being passed around there that you've got there on one of the first few pages. And it was neat for me to see this. I saw this at the Traveling Bible of the museum, and it was great to see this behind glass and to look at it. And as I was looking, squinting, trying to read the Greek on it, this is very familiar, the Greek I was reading, because the night before, I try to read about some Greek from the Bible every night or every day. And as I was reading it, I was thinking, I just read this last night. So the very verse that's on it, I just read the previous night. Wow, I was just reading this. Anyway, so very exciting it was to see. But this is Papyrus 39. And there you have pictures of, there's the front and the back. Now beyond these fragments that you see, we have many codices. The singular is codex. And those are just bound volumes, bigger than fragments, but bound volumes of books. And we have several of them from the 4th century onward. Very few fragments from the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century. But once the 4th century kicked in and the paper quality got better, basically, we have more of those bindings. Also, another reason we have more from the 4th century onward is that persecution of the church had basically stopped. In the 4th century, you get into Constantine, who wanted Christianity to flourish. Prior to that, there was a lot of persecution of the church under the Roman emperors, a lot of burning of any scrolls, of any New Testament copies. And so it's very rare that something from the first 3 centuries has survived. In addition to what we have in Greek, we have, remember I said that Greek fell out the Greek language fell out of favor in the Mediterranean world, so Latin took over. So around about the 4th century, the Bible needed to be translated into Latin, and that was the work of St. Jerome, who translated the Vulgate Bible. I think it was in 382. But we have from 8 to 10,000 Latin Vulgate manuscripts. So even though they are not exactly copies, because they're in a different language, we have translations from the 4th century and 5th century and onward of the Bible. In addition to the Latin, we have around 24,000 of these, whether they're fragments or pages or bound volumes of the New Testament in different languages other than Greek. So we have in the many, many thousands copies of the New Testament, either in fragment form or whole form from the first few centuries. Okay, any questions so far?
So we weren't here at first. The Old Testament was actually done in stone. More so?
The Old Testament, no, that was done on scrolls.
In scrolls, and it was written. Why did they hold up better than the New Testament paper?
They were, not too much. Certainly they were, well, the scrolls that we have from the Hebrew Bible. So imagine the last of the Old Testament was written about like the 4th century BC. And then prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls being discovered, the most recent we had was from AD 900, which means we didn't have, prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls being discovered, we didn't have anything, any copies any older than 1,300 years. So a 1,300-year span between when the Old Testament was written and these copies. So 1,300-year span, and nothing in between. Then in 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and they closed that gap. So they were from around roughly the time of Christ, a few centuries spanning there. So it kind of cut that gap down to about 1/3. And those scrolls they held up really well under time. They have held up because they've been preserved very well in canisters. But these things, this writing wasn't meant to, they didn't think it was going to last for millennia. It was copied for the temple or, whoever, the synagogue, the church, whatever books we're talking about, to read. And they weren't thinking, let's hope that this copy survives for 2,000 years. So people in 2,000 years can read it. Because if they were even thinking about people in 2,000 years, us, they would have been thinking, well, they can copy. People will just keep on copying. So they weren't really meant to hold up under time. Now, in addition to all these very old copies of manuscripts, even if they're little fragments, so we have many, many thousands, we have quotations from the early church fathers. Now, this is considered the big wigs of the church, the main teachers, from the first 4 centuries after Jesus. So they wrote their sermons, lectionaries, Sunday school lessons, whatever they did, they would write their lessons just like we do today and pastors do today, and quoting scripture. So when we find this thing that was written in the 4th century, or a copy of something written in the 3rd or 4th century by one of the teachers in the church, even though it's not a copy of the Bible, it still is in the sense that it's a quotation from the Bible. So it's still an attestation to what the Bible said back then. And the reason all this is important to get these old copies is we want to make sure that the Bible that we have today accurately reflects what the Bible said 2,000 years ago. And so it's good to see what did the Bible say back then, and we see it says the same thing as it said back then. But we have 36,000 citations of the New Testament from the early church fathers. 36,000 biblical quotes that we can find in the writings. So I find it interesting that even if we had absolutely none of these manuscripts, the Greek, the Latin, the Coptic, and the Syriac, if we were just to rely on the quotations from the first few centuries of the church teachers, we could reconstruct the entire New Testament just from their writings, from all their quotations, with the exception of 11 verses. Excuse me. So again, those quotes reassure us that what the Bible says, what we have in our modern Bibles, is what it said back then.
Does the Latin Vulgate have everything? It does.
And more.
And more.
Well, that's a scary thing I just said. The Latin Vulgate, yes, St. Jerome, it has all the books of the Bible. It's also got all the apocryphal books that are in the Catholic Bible. It was used, I don't think St. Jerome believed that those were, and the church at that time, I don't think, believed that it was God's inspired word, but still they revered it. It was a good, to them, a religious text. It was used in the church. And so St. Jerome was thinking, well, I should copy this because we use it in our Bibles. So yeah, it had those as well.
And who's St. Jerome? Did I miss that?
St. Jerome was the fellow who translated the Bible into Latin. Yeah, 382, I think, was the year. So he's the one who did the Vulgate Bible. Nobody was reading Greek anymore, or very few people. So the people of the day read Latin. People needed a Bible to be able to read in their own Latin language, and so he did that translation. And it was many centuries later that Latin fell out of use, and as the centuries go on, it was German and English. And so I think Dennis Johnson will probably teach in a few weeks about those who translated the Bible. Luther translating it to German, Wycliffe and Tyndale translating it to English. But that's for another week. Okay, so the bottom line of this is we have a tremendous number of early manuscripts of very old quotations from the Bible, so we can see what the Bible said back then and compare it with what we have now. Now, I want to contrast that with, for most non-biblical ancient texts, the copies we have are, and we're talking about the writings of Plato, of Julius Caesar, Aristotle. You can see the table down below on page 2. We have copies that are from 500, 800, even 1,000 years after they were written. Are there any other spare sheets on the tables? No. Are y'all good back there? Do you have any of these? Yep. Okay. You can come get this one. Or Shannon. Oh, Shannon, thank you very much. You and I can share. All right. Thank you. All right. I only made 16. I didn't think. Wow. Okay. That's wonderful. Okay, so the next runner-up for ancient manuscripts, and again, we're looking at now a contest. Like when we look at old manuscripts, what books in ancient literature is there a short gap between when it was actually written and when we have the oldest copies of? So we have, for example, in the table there, the writings of Plato. Now, Plato wrote, you can see the years when he was doing his writing in the 5th and 4th century BC, and the earliest copies we have of his writings are from AD 900. That's a 1,200-year gap. And we have 7 copies. And my point here is that the Bible, our copies of the Bible, far exceed that, and yet we don't question, is this what Plato actually wrote? For the most part, we say, yeah, this is the writings of Plato. There is no reason to doubt that it's been changed. And yes, there might have been little typographical changes along the way, but for the most part, when we take Plato's writings, we say, yes, we believe, because there's no reason to doubt otherwise, to think otherwise, that this is what Plato wrote. Julius Caesar, such as his commentaries on the Gallic Wars, he wrote in the 1st century BC. The earliest copies of his writings are from about the year 900. There's a 1,000-year gap where changes could have been made, and we have only 10 copies. And yet we don't think, the conspiracy theorists don't think, someone probably changed what Julius Caesar had written. No, we for the most part agree and believe, because there's no reason to think otherwise, that what we have, these copies from 900, are pretty much what Julius Caesar wrote. Aristotle, his writings, there's a 1,400-year gap between when he wrote and the earliest copies that we have. Sophocles as well, 1,400-year gap. The next runner-up beyond the Bible is Homer's Iliad. Now, Homer wrote the Iliad about the year 900 BC, and the earliest copies we have are from AD 200. That would be an 1,100-year gap, and we have a phenomenal 643 copies. And so this gives great attesting that, so many copies, and even though there's a 1,100-year gap, we agree that, okay, this represents what Homer wrote. And unfortunately, we don't have the originals from Homer, but there's no reason to think that these copies would have been changed, so we go with that. Well, the New Testament far exceeds any of those. Again, the New Testament was written in the various books sometime between the year 50 and 100. We have the earliest copies to within a few decades of that. And we have, just in the Greek alone, about 5,800 manuscripts. And so my point in this is, we believe that what we have from Julius Caesar, from Sophocles, from Josephus, from Tacitus, all these historians, people who wrote things down in ancient times, we believe that what we have are accurate copies of what they wrote. Critics of the Bible often like to dismiss the New Testament as being unreliable because they say, well, there was a several decade gap. There was a several decade gap, and so it could have been changed. Well, the thing is, if you really logically want to follow that line of thinking, then you have to dismiss all that we know about ancient history. All of our ancient history you have to toss out the window as well, because there are much larger gaps in all of that. So if we apply the same standard to the New Testament, to these writings, that we do normally to historical documents, then we have to accept that these are very reliable copies. Okay, so that's what I have to say about biblical manuscripts. Any questions? Yes?
I have a comment.
Good, those are easy for me.
Well, observation too. In the Islamic world, that is one of the things that they use, and one of the arguments they use to refute Christianity is that, well, you know, the Bible's been changed over the years, and it just doesn't hold water because of the facts that you just outlined.
Right.
So, you know, when they say, well, you know, the Bible's been changed, so it's not real, and of course they know that the Old Testament is true. They believe what's written in the Old Testament, but
except for the parts that Christians obviously changed.
Exactly. Yes, that's the ones that they.
Yes.
But you know that, and talking to my son, his response to that is, well, okay, God is all powerful. He can't restore. He can't preserve His word through the ages. So that's kind of it's a real fallacy that they're trying to teach in
so there's no evidence. It's just something you can say, but it doesn't make it true. You know, the Bible's been changed. I am very confident, and you know, it's a passion of mine to know what did the Bible say. I am very confident in what I see in these old manuscripts. And when I read in my Greek Bible, I have little footnotes down below that say what other alternate, because sometimes a word, you know, over the centuries, a slight word has been changed. Sometimes names particularly have various spellings. Even on into the 14th and 15th century, people's names could be spelled. Now, I get upset when anyone misspells my name, you know, putting an H in John. But up until about the 15th or 16th century, names changed in spelling, and so there are different manuscripts that have slightly different spellings. But it's neat. I can see in my little footnotes in my Bible what these different changes are. And so it's not. So some people say that the Christians are trying to hide that really there are all these different. You know, it's the embarrassment to Christianity that there are these different things. No, it's not an embarrassment, and actually it is these slight variations that help to confirm what it actually said, but that's a lesson for another day. Okay, let me talk to you about other things beyond biblical, good morning, beyond biblical manuscripts. We have a historian, Flavius Josephus, and here's a note to myself that says, John, bring the copy from the church library. Didn't bring it. Maybe next week. Flavius Josephus wrote a book, Antiquities. That's what it's called, the Antiquities. And so he's this great Jewish historian. He wrote in the 1st century. And in our church library, there are copies of his volume. He basically wrote a history of the Jewish people from creation on to his time. He was born in the year AD 37, well known among historians. He was a Pharisee, and he completed the Antiquities in about the year 93. So what I want to talk is what he describes and how it confirms what we read in the Bible. He describes a high priest named Ananias who took advantage of a Roman governor Festus's death, and this was mentioned in the New Testament, to have James killed. And this is a quote. This is what Josephus wrote, translated into English. I think his original was in Latin, but here's the English. He convened a meeting, this would be Ananias, he convened a meeting of the Sanhedrin and brought before them a man named James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, and certain others. He accused them of having transgressed the law and delivered them up to be stoned. Okay, so this is corroboration from the first century of that there was a man named Jesus, that this man named Jesus was worthy of being mentioned. So Josephus isn't even writing about Jesus, he's writing about James. But he thinks it's important enough to add in the brother of Jesus. Jesus must be at least someone important here. And that some considered Jesus to be the Christ, the anointed one or the Messiah. Which isn't to say that Josephus believed that he was the Christ. Josephus didn't. But Josephus is just recording history and recording what people believed at the time. This is from a book called Testimonium Flaviana, meaning the testimony of Flavius. Excuse me. Okay, about this time, do you have this quote in your thing? Okay. Now, before I read it, I have underlined some terms, underlined some phrases in it. The underlined parts, while they might first strike you as the most exciting parts, the flip side, the reason I've underlined them is because they're the parts that historians have figured that people probably later inserted. So the underlined parts, while they are very exciting, because they talk about Christ, they have probably been inserted later on. Nevertheless, here it is. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who performed surprising deeds, a teacher of such people as accepted the truth gladly. And he drew over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. And when upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. For he appeared to them again, spending a third day restored to life. The divine prophets having foretold these things and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. Okay, so again, it's a hotly debated passage just because scholars believe that there have been insertions, because one of the reasons is those things that I have underlined, those insertions, are things that Josephus didn't believe. Josephus mostly would not have written he was the Christ, and he appeared restored on the third day, because Josephus himself didn't believe that. But even if you disregard those passages that we think have been inserted, it corroborates, again, first century corroboration, that Jesus was the martyred leader of a church in Jerusalem, that he was a wise teacher with a following that lasted, that he was crucified under Pilate, prompted by Jewish leaders. Now, Josephus is considered to be a very reliable historian. His accounts of the Jewish war have provided very accurate, and he's been corroborated through archaeology and other historians. And so sometimes, occasionally, the smart people on the internet, you'll read, oh, we don't even know if Jesus existed. Whoever says that doesn't know what they're talking about. No historian would ever say that. We know quite a bit about Jesus from non-biblical, from non-Christian sources. Other events or people mentioned in the New Testament that are confirmed by Josephus, we have that Herod, he conquered Jerusalem in 37 BC. He was, so the whole area was under Roman rule, but the Romans sort of left Judea alone, sort of. Romans ruled, they collect their taxes, but it was on a far extreme of the empire, and they basically said, Judea, y'all rule yourself, and just don't cause any trouble to the Roman Empire, and we'll mostly stay out of your business. Mostly. They still collected taxes and things. Well, I don't know how much they stayed out of their business, because they still installed a king. So the Roman Senate in 37 BC, they declared him king of the Jews, and he went to conquer Judea. Now, even though the Roman Senate declared him king of the Jews, that still didn't give him to the Judeans the right to rule, he had to go and wage a war. And there was a war against Judean. He finally conquered Jerusalem, and then he was the king of the king of the Jews. But it was still under Roman rule. Then there was what is known historically as the Massacre of the Innocents. This is in the Gospel of Matthew. Josephus, so you think about in, I want to say Matthew 2, I think, where Herod said that all of the infants, born about the time of Jesus in the area should be killed. And we can read about in the Bible. Josephus mentions that Herod executed hundreds of people. He said Herod was very paranoid. He thought that everyone was out to take his throne away from him, or a lot of people were out to take his throne away from him, and maybe they were, but he executed many, many hundreds of political rivals. He executed 3 of his own sons, and this was between the time of 7 and 4 BC, about the time that Matthew's writing about. Josephus doesn't specifically mention a call to kill the infants in the region. He just generally mentions executing lots of people, hundreds of people. But in that, the area of Bethlehem had such a small population, probably had a population of about 1,000. Statistically, it would have amounted to maybe about a dozen or 2 dozen infants being killed. So Josephus wouldn't have felt the need to mention specifically maybe 1 or 2 dozen infants being killed, when in the broader scheme of things, he was killing many, many people. So Josephus doesn't specifically mention the killing of the babies. Now, the killing of babies by Herod, where else is this mentioned? There's a book written in the 1st century AD called The Assumption of Moses that mentions it. So this was some manner of religious text, and so writing in some history. Some of it true, some of it false maybe, but it does mention this thing that Herod did. There's also another book called The Infancy Gospel of James that basically seems to have been someone copied Matthew 2, which is what it amounts to, probably in the 2nd century. And whether there's truth or falseness in these writings, the main thing is that there is, in the 1st century and the 2nd century, somebody wrote about this killing of infants. So it's not something that someone would say, oh, that was maybe made up centuries later. No, we have writing about it outside of the Bible in the first few centuries. Herod died after a lunar eclipse. We read this in Josephus' writings. Sometime either 12 or 13 March, we have it down to a day or two, of 4 BC, that's when Herod died. His sarcophagus was found in 2007. It had been smashed, though, sometime in antiquity, sometime in ancient times, his sarcophagus had been smashed because he was greatly despised. So they buried him, and somebody through the centuries just did away with that. Okay, let me think maybe 2 more minutes. We'll talk about Quirinius. If you read in Luke 2:2, it says, in those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. So Quirinius, he was a Roman aristocrat, the governor of Syria. He lived from 51 BC to AD 21. And Josephus wrote about this census. Josephus wrote about that Augustus took a variety of censuses, particularly in the years 28 BC, 8 BC, which would have been the one that Luke is referring to, and AD 14. And at the time, the area, the Roman Empire, had the Roman world probably about 4 to 5 million citizens. And also, not only did Josephus write about this, but Tacitus, a fellow that I'll talk about next week, he mentions that these censuses were taken in the Roman world. All right, well, that'll do it for today. Do you have any questions, comments? Yes, thank you.